I'm an immunologist, as Martin said. I've worked on the immune system for over 30 years, actually. I began working on HIV back in the 80s, which some of you may remember. And then I got into inflammatory diseases. So my main research area is the inflammatory process. And I've worked on things like rheumatoid arthritis. I've worked on Crohn's disease, Parkinson's, and infectious diseases, because things like, flu actually causes an inflammatory response in the airways, as I guess you all might know. And then in my lab, then we mainly look for anti-inflammatory therapeutics, would be the main sort of output from our research. But of course, when COVID came along, many immunology labs switched into COVID. And I've got 4 projects actually just out the door here behind me working on COVID, mainly working, as I say, on the inflammatory process. We've got very interested in coagulation actually recently, because that's a key part of COVID as well. But at the same time, that as Martin alluded to, I was doing stuff in the media. I'm a big keen science communicator. I still teach here in Trinity, our students, and I've been doing stuff on the radio over the years, really. So when COVID began, of course, I was asked more and more about my opinion, and many of us stepped up. I mean, I think at this stage, people got sick of seeing immunologists on the main evening news. Thankfully, that's gone down a bit because COVID is now beginning to relent. But we're very honoured to be asked to do it, and privileged in a sense, because we're sharing our knowledge. And I began following COVID from January of 2020. It began for me at a conference in January 6th, 2020. It seems like the dark ages now. And I met a world expert on coronaviruses. That conference was about viruses and metabolism. And I met a world expert on coronavirus, and he said to me, "Have you seen this new one?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd seen a bit about it, but at that stage it wasn't that worrying because there was no evidence of human to human transmission." And he said, "Oh no," he said, "this is going to be very serious." And he said something to me that resonated. He said, "We won't get out of this until 70% of the world has been infected or vaccinated." And actually that was prophetic. And I'll come back to that towards the end as about where we're headed next, kind of thing. So from that moment on, then it ramps up and up, as you would all remember. My own research changes to work on COVID more and more. But for the purposes of just this session, I'm going to give you my overview of, I think, where we've got to in that time frame, I guess, and what might happen next, and try and do a bit of a prognosis for the future, as I have it on this slide here. Let's get my pointer going. And it's hard to predict the future, obviously, but still we've learned so much in the past year and a half. It's staggering. And this next slide gives you the triumph, and you all know this as well, I would imagine. I mean, a year ago, but this is actually June 15, 2020, there were no vaccines approved. There were loads in development. We didn't know when the vaccines would arrive. 1 year on, look at this, 8 vaccines have been approved. That's globally. We've 4 that the EMA in Europe have approved, as we all know. And there's lots more coming up behind, by the way. Look at all these numbers, 30 in phase 3. So what a remarkable achievement for the world of science, the world of pharmaceuticals. All the drug companies stepped up and began trying to make these vaccines. Huge effort, tens of thousands of people, and now we have these highly effective and safe vaccines to deploy. I mean, the first result to me was in November last year when Pfizer announced their 93% efficacy, I think it was, in their big phase 3 trial. So we were all relieved that this would be a disease we could have vaccines against. The challenge then became, beginning in December of last year, how to get people to take the vaccine. And that was not a trivial task, remember. I mean, there was many people who were anxious, there was hesitancy, there was misinformation, and then to our delight, many countries, many people step forward and begin to take the vaccine. And this is a league table of vaccine uptake. Ireland has done extremely well, 15th in the world. This was made about a week ago. We're even higher now, I think. We're 4th in Europe in terms of 90% of our over 18s being fully vaccinated. It's been a huge response from the Irish people. And that just shows you people realised how serious this was. They listened to the experts, hopefully people like myself and my colleagues and Tony Hood and all the panoply of people. Brian McCrae deserves huge credit. He led the vaccine campaign, really. And thankfully people said, yes, this is the right thing to do. All the data was available, of course, and you could see the clinical trials. You could read the reports from the EMA and the FDA, and people made their own mind up and decided that the vaccination was the thing to do. Of course, now we move on from this and wonder about the challenges that we now face. Vaccine equity is a massive issue. I made this slide about a week ago as well. 33% of the world now is fully vaccinated, which is tremendous. But the red places are where they aren't. We need to get the vaccine out globally, and everybody knows this. And there's a huge global campaign now. And of course, the main reason for this is to help them because they need it. And there's many people who are vulnerable, unvaccinated. But secondly, to stop new variants. And that's our next concern in many ways. Variants have cropped up. They crop up because every time the virus copies itself, it makes an error. It's got a random rate of error, and that error might mean a more difficult virus, that the virus will change because of those errors potentially. And we've all seen what's happened. Delta is now the commonest variant, can increase transmissibility. There's some evidence of it being less susceptible to the immune system, so therefore you get more illness potentially because of it. The only way to stop variants is full vaccination against the current situation, to stop new variants cropping up. And that's what has to happen globally to stop any more variants arising. Now, the good news is the vaccines are protecting against Delta, and they're protecting against severe disease, and that's really what matters. Let's face it, so mostly what matters anyway. Still, huge efficacy against hospitalization and death with all 5 vaccines in this slide, all 4 of them that are approved in Europe, are giving good protection against severe disease and death. That's a relief. So, in other words, Delta isn't breaking through hugely to cause disease and death in those who are vaccinated, which is great. You do see some infections in the vaccinated because it's more transmissible. But thankfully, the vaccine is stopping that progressing into severe disease. And there's a bit of recent data for you that confirms this. Now remember, we're still in the thick of this. We still need data to support our view on things, and lots of data is coming. There's a deluge of data happening every day almost. And here's some data from the UK. If you're unvaccinated, you have an 11-fold increased risk of ending up in hospital than if you're vaccinated with Delta. Okay. In other words, the vaccines are protecting against hospitalization and death with Delta, which is great. Here's data from the US. This is 5 states we're looked at. This is the rate of hospitalization in the community, and the vast majority are unvaccinated, the ones who are in hospital. The ones who are fully vaccinated, a much lower level of hospitalization there, which is tremendous. So this is the evidence that we have that the vaccines are working against Delta, which is the key thing. Our next question then though becomes, and there's endless questions that keep cropping up, remember, are the vaccines waning anyway? In other words, are we seeing a lessening of efficacy as time goes by? Now again, good and bad news here. The good news is that the vaccines are giving persistent immunity. This is a study showing 6 months out from vaccination, still very high levels of antibody, still very high levels of memory B cells and memory T cells. These are the key cell types you want to protect us. Remember, here's the memory B cells still making antibodies. That's in a healthy cohort of people. So in other words, 6 months post-vaccination, there's evidence of still a good immune response against Delta and any variant, we hope, by the way. However, it's all about these memory B cells, and they are persisting. However, what about waning of immunity? And if there is evidence of waning, we'll have to start thinking about boosters. Our next challenge with COVID is the booster campaign. Who should get boosters? When should they get them? All these questions are very active at the moment. And literally in the last 3 days, this has become very live because of data coming out. This paper in The Lancet looked at the evidence and said current evidence does not therefore appear to show a need for boosters in the general population, in which efficacy against severe disease remains high. And that's true. The general population, so far, the evidence suggests that the vaccinations are still working and still offering protection. And then 2 days ago, Public Health England released a deluge of data on this question. They've been measuring the immune response to people post-vaccination, and is there anything changing? In other words, are we seeing any evidence of increased deaths, say, or increased hospitalization 6 months post-vaccination? Now, the good news again is they're holding up against death, which is great. And of course, this is the most severe consequence of the disease. And there's a slight waning. So here we see weeks since the second dose. Okay, so 20 weeks out, say. For the over 16s, there's a slight waning with the AstraZeneca vaccine. And so there's a slight drop in protection against the risk of death. Pfizer's performing better. And if you're over 65, there's slightly more waning going on. So again, we're seeing a decrease in protection. It goes to 80%, say, in the way this graph is drawn with AstraZeneca versus Pfizer. And then with this one, it's even more important. There's no doubt in the clinically vulnerable, there's been a significant waning over time, 40% drop in protection. And this is against severe disease. And Pfizer has dropped as well in terms of protection against severe disease. Less so if you're not vulnerable, but still if you're over 65, again a waning is happening. If you're at risk in this clinically at risk group, again a waning. Now, if you're not in a clinical at risk group, and you're under the age of 64, the waning is a lot less, even though there's some waning happening. So that's a good thing. And then this one's important. If you're over 80, now again, tremendous data here from Public Health England to measure this in thousands and thousands of people. Over 80, a substantial waning of protection. This is hospitalization. So in other words, 20 weeks out, we see a 30% decrease in protection in the over 80s. Over 65, again, a decrease in protection against hospitalization. And look at this, 40 to 64-year-olds, again, AstraZeneca is showing a waning in terms of protection against hospitalization. Over 16s, less so. Now, what does all this mean? Well, again, we're trying to interpret this data. And again, we have evidence from Israel coming out as well. And that's informing this discussion. And what the Israelis are doing is they are giving a booster to everybody 6 months post-vaccination. And we're seeing a big decrease in cases in the ones who've received boosters. So the booster is working in Israel. 2 doses are still offering some protection. Unvaccinated are where most of the cases are. But look at this, severe cases, the booster is protecting hugely. Again, there's protection from the 2-shot regimen, so they're still working in terms of if you're vaccinated with the 2 shots. But again, the unvaccinated, much higher risk of severe disease and deaths. Again, the booster is protecting massively. Double vaccines are still protecting against death, and then the unvaccinated are the ones who are seeing death rates that are being higher. What does all this mean? Well, it means a booster campaign has to begin. That's the first thing. And the UK have decided to embark on everybody over 50 is going to get boosters because of all this data. And in fact, if you go out to, this is their timelines for this. Once you get to January, they would have given boosters to all the over 50s. We start with the over 80s first and then begin to go down to the other age groups. In Ireland, we have a campaign already beginning. Residents aged 60 and older in long-term residential care. All the over 80s will be given boosters as well. And the advice will become, and many of us are saying this, from the UK, we should be giving boosters to everybody over 60. The reason for that is they mainly got AstraZeneca, remember, in Ireland. And it's the AstraZeneca vaccine that's waning more than Pfizer. So it would make sense then to give all the over 60s a booster shot. And that, we hope, will be what will happen. The recommendation isn't there yet. We're beginning with the other age groups. Now, this is a stepwise process. But the sensible thing to do at this stage, based on the data from the UK in particular, and in Israel to some extent, is over 60s who've had AstraZeneca should be given a 3rd shot. Now we know, of course, that this will work. And the evidence from Israel is that 3rd shot causes a massive immune response. There was a study again this week showing if you get a 3rd shot of Pfizer, you get 10-fold more antibodies than you do with a 2nd shot. So in other words, and we know there's some other vaccines, by the way, the hepatitis B vaccine is a 3-shot vaccine. So we can be optimistic that the booster campaign will give a massive immune response that may protect for years. I mean, that's the hope here, that we won't need to keep revaccinating people. Of course, if another variant crops up, we'll have to give a booster every winter, just like flu. So it's very much a work in progress, and we've got to see what's going to happen next. There are companies making the Dream vaccine that will work against any variants, and that's the next thing that will happen. Watch. Of course, we may be giving boosters in the form of a variant-specific vaccine like we do. That's a reasonable thing to promote, is that every winter the possibility is that we'll be boosting people who are vulnerable. Now, the chance of us having to boost everybody is unlikely, simply because the vaccines have worked in the under 60s really strongly, you know, and you may get persistent immunity for a year or more from that, you know. So in other words, we don't anticipate having to vaccinate everybody with boosters. It's just going to be like flu. The more vulnerable ones and the more at risk will be given boosters. Now, remember though, it's not just about vaccines. We have seen tremendous progress in treatments, and this is my area now specifically. Remember, COVID is an inflammatory disease of the airways, mainly other organs as well, but it's mainly a inflammatory disease of lungs. And it's been remarkable. And this study just made this 2 days ago. Here are all the therapies that have been proven to work in double-blind, placebo-controlled trials. The recovery trial in the UK revealed dexamethasone, for example. And all of these agents have now shown efficacy as treatments in hospital. Dexamethasone, the anti-inflammatory steroid, that has shown benefits. Baricitinib is a JAK1 inhibitor, part of the immune system. It's anti-inflammatory. That's shown benefits. Tocilizumab targets, I think, on IL-6. This is bread and butter to me. I work on these things in my lab. All these 2 drugs, baricitinib and tocilizumab, they're used to treat rheumatoid arthritis. They're very good anti-inflammatories. They got repurposed into COVID. And again, the data is very strong. They're given 20-30% of people who otherwise would have died are being protected with these agents. They're real add-ons. And then we have, of course, the antibody cocktails. Regeneron and Lilly, these monoclonal antibodies against the spike protein, they show benefits. In fact, as high as 70% decrease in mortality in one of the trials if you give people these antibodies. Remdesivir, That is a direct antiviral drug. It's an RNA polymerase inhibitor. That shows benefits as well. And then interferon beta, that's a cytokine. That's made by your immune system naturally. That has antiviral effects. They're giving that to people again with disease, and the interferon beta now is having an antiviral effect. And again, inhaled interferon is interesting. So all of these are showing efficacy from these trials. And by the way, there's 1,000 trials running, over 1,000 trials with other anti-inflammatory approaches and therapeutic approaches for COVID. So again, we're kind of winning the war in the hospital as well. We're not there yet. I mean, none of these are 100% efficacious across the whole population, but still they're showing benefits, and that gives us even more grounds for confidence that the therapeutics now available. Now, I might finish then. Oh, by the way, this is a good way to look at the whole thing, the disease course. We know so much about this disease now. You know, you get infected and it progresses into severe disease, the black line there, and then hospitalization happens. You know, if you vaccinate, of course, you stop all that, and that dotted line is the vaccine. You know, that's people that are vaccinated. We see a big effect on severe disease and death. And then remember, we'll need boosters to keep the vaccines going, I suppose, is the way to think of it in certain groups. And then the therapeutics, of course, here's the anti-inflammatories. They're stopping the host inflammatory response. And again, they are having efficacy. The dotted line here are people on anti-inflammatories. So we're seeing a decrease in hospitalization with vaccines. We're seeing a decrease in severe disease. And we're seeing treatments now in hospital getting better as well to limit the damage being caused by this virus. And ultimately then, you know, people are surviving who've been infected. And that's what's happening. And we're seeing lots of progress in this regard. So I'll finish now with my view of the possible scenarios. Well, first and foremost, and most importantly, immunity is building up in our population. It's happening naturally as well, by the way, of course, that's the way the immune system is supposed to be, it gives you natural protection. But secondly, vaccines are having a tremendous effect, and it's the safest way to build up immunity, and that's great. London at the moment, I saw a study 2 days ago, 95% of people have antibodies now against this virus in London, a random sample. So again, natural immunity, vaccine-induced immunity is beating the virus, and that would have been the way it was before vaccines, remember. Vaccines are doing this in a safe way, which is tremendous. Therapies getting better all the time, as I mentioned. There's issues around access and cost, of course, but still, therapies are getting better. We must get the vaccine out to all countries. That brings in vaccine equity as our challenge there, because that stops variants, and they need the vaccine desperately. Boosters will be needed in older people and those who are vulnerable, remember, as I said, and the evidence now supports that. And we're beginning our booster campaign in Ireland. And then finally, getting back to my opening statement, we will most likely exit the pandemic when 80%, it's gone up because Delta is more transmissible. It was 70% with the old one. So we got to get more back. We got to get more protection from this virus with natural immunity and vaccination. Once we get to 80%, as they've been infected or fully vaccinated, or a combination of both, we would exit the pandemic. It becomes an endemic infection then, like any other. And here's what's going to happen. This will be in the medical textbooks. 2 or 3, 4 years time, you go to the infectious diseases chapter, COVID-19, another infectious disease, preventable with vaccination and treatable in hospitals, just like other infectious diseases in that part of the textbook, and that's what it will become. And that's where we're headed. Now there's unknowns. The unknowns are new variants. Another big unknown is, will schools see a surge? That will be a big worry if we see an uptick in incidence in children. And we've got to be wary of this. We've got to prepare for this. But we know what to do. We know the way out of this. And the way out of it, as I just said to you, is boosters, vaccination, and therapeutics in hospitals. And I'll finish there. And thank you for listening. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, that was a brilliant talk, Luke. It's a tour de force, and hopefully we could make this available on our website. I'm sure there'll be a lot of people that will want to view it again, and other people will want to look at it. One quick question: it seems the topic of the origin of COVID, so discussion around that has been suppressed, and there's the infamous Peter Daszak authored note to the Lancet. So what are your thoughts on the origin of COVID, and what might we be able to learn?
It's such an important question, Martin, obviously enough. It's very hard. The answer, we don't know. I mean, there's no evidence at the moment to suggest there was a lab leak or an accidental spillover in the lab, say, but we just don't know. I mean, we know it came from bats. We're pretty sure of that. The closest relative to SARS-CoV-2 is in a bat. It's 96% identical to SARS-CoV-2. So it's a descendant from that bat virus, if you like. The question is, where do they get the 4% from? Now, it could have gone into an intermediate species and then mutated into this really malign version that infects us. There could have been recombination between 2 coronaviruses to make it. That can all happen in the wild, and eventually we get this virus. Now, it could have been isolated from a bat and brought to a lab, and then there's an accident. That's still a possibility.
Yeah.
You know, we're pretty confident it wasn't engineered. That was the next worry we had, that somehow there was some tampering going on. You'd see that in the viral genome. So it wasn't an engineered virus. There's still a chance it was an accident in a lab. That's still a possibility. But the answer is we still don't know, and we'd love to find out. If it was a lab leak, that's not a bad thing, strangely, because it means it's less likely to happen again. If it came from the wild, there's a risk of another one cropping up randomly and infecting a human somewhere in China or Laos or Vietnam, you know. Whereas a lab leak is unlikely to happen again, because let's hope the precautionary measures are in place, you know.
Yeah.
So sadly, Martin, it's still an unknown.
Great. Okay, well, listen, thanks, Luke, Professor O'Neill. Brilliant talk, and we were honoured that you would join us today.